Hi everyone, I'm Farzana. I'm the Learning and Development Specialist at CERIC, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Today we are delighted to have a follow-up session with Dr. Kris Magnusson, professor at Simon Fraser University, on his Connexus conference keynote. We really appreciate his taking this time to join us to continue the learning on working with and around emotions in career helping. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that Hironvendat Petun Hode Shoni Hode Noshoni, Hanishinaabe and Mississauga Hanishinaabe of New Credit share a special relationship to the territory in which CERIC's office is located in Toronto. And I myself am based in Montreal right now on the traditional territory of Kanien'kehá:ka. I invite you to consider the indigenous connections, past and present, to the land where you are living. We are grateful to have the opportunity to learn together on these lands today. I would also like to take a few moments to introduce you to CERIC and share some housekeeping notes with you. CERIC is a charitable organization that focuses on education and research in career counseling and career development in Canada. We fund projects that create new knowledge and develop innovative resources. We have three main programs: Connexus, Canada's Career Development Conference, the CareerWise.ca website, which features the top news and views in the field with a French version called Orientation, and the Canada Journal of Career Development, which is free to access. You can learn more about all of CERIC's work and resources by visiting our website at ceric.ca. Also, and because CERIC is always looking at new webinars and learning opportunities for you, we encourage you to share your learning needs along with the feedback you have on this webinar in the survey that you will see at the end of the session. Now, a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. You can interact with Kris and Tony and ask your questions or share comments at any time by using the question function you see on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours after the session is finished. Now I would like to introduce Tony Botello, who will be moderating today's session with Kris. Tony is the director of Simon Fraser University's award-winning career volunteer services and past recipient of the Rob Shea Research Award and the Stu Conger Award for Leadership in Career Development. I'll now pass the floor to Tony to start our conversation with Kris. To you, Tony. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Farzana. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this free webinar, a conversation with Dr. Kris Magnusson on working with and around emotions in career helping. As mentioned, all registered participants will receive the video recording of this webinar, and it will remain available indefinitely. I think many of you are already familiar with Kris's work, so I'm going to keep it simple. It's my privilege and honor to be part of this event and to be helping moderate the Q&A, as some of you know. Both Kris and I are connected. We both work at Simon Fraser University. We're both in the field of career development, and of course, we make up 2/3 of a Bee Gees cover band. So, which again we'll have to bring back soon when things come back to normal. So, with that, I'm going to pass the floor back to Kris to introduce yourself and get things off for this. Well, in my case, morning, but it could be any time for anyone in our group. So. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tony. And it's always interesting to me to hear how I'll be introduced by you. I discover all kinds of new things when I hear my introduction. So the Bee Gees cover band, that's a good one. I'd like to start by posing a quick survey question. And that is simply, what do you think are the biggest career challenges facing your clients or the people that you work with? And while you're thinking about that and putting in an answer to the question, I'd like to introduce this session by giving you a quick overview of some of the keynote themes from the keynote address. You may not have had a chance to see that, so I'll give you about a 5-minute summary, which might make you wonder why we needed 45 minutes for the keynote if I can actually summarize it in 5. But beside that, like Farzana, I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, the Coquitlam, and the Musqueam nations. But I'd also like to acknowledge the emotional territory that many of you might be in. If you're listening from Canada, you've probably reacted with some degree of shock at the discovery of 215 unmarked graves of children on the grounds of the former Kamloops residential school. It is one thing to know that such things happened, and it's quite another when they are confirmed. And our hearts go out to all of the families and the generations affected by this finding, and of the many similar findings that are surely to come. COVID is slowly relaxing its icy grip on this nation, and while there is a renewal of hope that things may soon be turning around, there's also a pervasive sense of coping fatigue and even frustration after a year and a half of shutdowns and enforced isolations. These are only two examples of systemic experiences that have strong emotional attachments for many people. So whatever challenges you are facing today and whatever emotions you have attached themselves to those challenges, I just want you to know that we honor your presence here as you work through or around your own emotions. Looking at the Wordle that's coming up, we can see some big themes starting to come up in the things that your clients are facing. A lot of them are emotional themes. Mental health is coming up, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, lack of motivation, overcoming barriers, poverty, skills mismatches. There's a wealth of challenges that our clients are facing, and sometimes it can feel pretty daunting, both to the helper and to the person that we're trying to help. So in this context of a challenging and rapidly changing world environment that we find ourselves in, here are a few of the points from the keynote that I want to just kind of underline before we go into our Q&A. The first point I tried to make was that our field, maybe unjustly, but I believe could be characterized as having an over-reliance on information and decision strategies. And tied to that is a belief that if we simply provide the appropriate skills, that clients will be able to navigate their way through the career development challenges that they face. And in contrast to that, I argue that we need to recognize and then harness the roles that both perception and emotion play in helping clients to prepare for an unpredictable future. Information itself is neutral, but the perceptions that people have, the beliefs that they hold that are deeply embedded within their sense of being, and then the emotions that are attached to those perceptions and beliefs have an unsettling and distorting impact on information. And people will not interpret information the same way that we present it. So information is neutral, but it tends to get distorted. And then I talked about 5 kinds of career perception problems that lead to some of these distortions. The first one was that we have a tendency, a natural inclination to fill in the blanks. And that is that we're given a few points of information, we'll put those points together and try to form a pattern, even in the absence of complete data. The second one is that if we cannot form a pattern, we tend to suffer from what I call ambiguity paralysis. Not knowing which way to turn, we tend to cease acting on our environment. So when we can't see a clear pattern, our tendency is to just kind of slow things down or stop altogether. The third challenge, or the third perception problem, was that when we try to solve a problem, we tend to very quickly form what I call a habit of the mind. And that is that we tend to perseverate on a strategy, whether it's working or not. And then that habit that we form, even if we formed it very quickly, tends to get in the way of all subsequent behaviors or actions or even perceptions. The fourth career perception problem that I talked about, I call jumping to conclusions. And that is having an a priori expectation of what we will see and then interpreting all subsequent information to be consistent with that expectation. So we have a belief about what we're about to see, and then we might even ignore up to 90% of the new data coming in and only see things consistent with that belief that we've already held. And then the biggest of the perceptual filters are emotional filters. And so each of the 4 perception issues has emotion linked to it. It may be frustration, it may be excitement, but whatever it is, there's an emotion attached to those perceptual processes. Those tend to be temporal emotions that are happening in the moment, but they're very, very powerful. And emotions can also be situational. They can be a product of the stage that we're in response to a particular changing environment. And I showed folks some work from the Menninger Foundation that talks about a curve, a morale curve, that is a relatively predictable sequence of emotions. So looking at the challenges your clients face, the next question I have is, given that there is so much emotion present, what emotions do you see in your clients as they face their challenge? So I'd like to put that poll up now. I know some of you have already been responding with emotional challenges that folks are facing, but what are the biggest emotions that you've seen in the clients that you tend to work with? So we'll get, see if we can get that Wordle put up. And while we're doing that, let's move to very quickly, what do you do when you're trying to work with clients' emotions? So in the talk, I mentioned that we work in human change processes, we work around 3 dominant domains: what people think, what people feel, and what people do. And it's really an important piece is that you recognize that if you make a change in any one of those 3 domains, it causes change to happen in the others. So if you want to create a change in thinking, you might do that by getting people to do something different. If you want to create a change in feeling, you might do that by getting them to think something different. So there are strategies that we can use that link to each of those 3 domains. So the feeling strategies, if you wanted to focus on that emotional domain, the most important thing I think we do is simply name the emotion. We do that through reflecting, or if we're not sure what's there, about asking questions. Tied to that is then to explore the impact of that emotion. I sense that you're feeling a little, as we see coming up on that Wordle so prominently, a little fear is going on. The client is facing fear. So name that. Looks to me like you're frightened by this. And then explore the impact of that. How does that fear or frustration or anxiety or anger, depression, apathy, any of these emotions that you're seeing in your clients, simply asking them, what is the impact of having that emotion with you right now? How is that impacting you? And then to harness that emotion, either by saying, how would you like to feel less frustrated? Or if they're talking about feeling, as sometimes happens, I see in smaller words, so fewer people talking about it, but clients can feel excited about the changes that are coming forward. So asking the question, how might we harness that excitement that you're feeling, that energy you're feeling right now? How can we use that to help you get to the next step of where you want to go? So those are just some very quick strategies that you can do around focusing on the emotional domain. Name the emotion is the really critical piece of that, making sure that the emotion doesn't become a hidden barrier. Once an emotion is named, it loses much of its power. But there are also strategies that we can use to deal with the thinking component. So when we're talking about how do we help shift the client's perspective, one of the most common ones is reframing. So you take the problem and you reframe it in a way they possibly hadn't thought of it. One example I used was if you're dealing with somebody who's talking about being unemployed and the unemployment rate is hovering around 12%, a reframe might sound like, well, let's see what we have to do to get you to be one of the 88%, not one of the 12%. You can also create perspective change by directing observation. So you get people to go look at some aspect of their environment, looking for something very specific. So you give them a target to look at. A good colleague and friend of mine once was working with a young lady who's interested in the service industry. So he sent her out to the mall and said, your job is to go find examples of what you think are good customer service or bad customer service. So this is directed observation. She went out and she saw all kinds of things going on that otherwise she wouldn't have noticed. And of course, the third one is teaching the clients how to engage in reflection, to think about their experience and to make sense of their experience in different ways. So perspective strategies such as reframing or directed observation or reflection can help change how people think about their situation or their future path. And the third domain is the behavioral domain. And there we can use a series of action strategies. I talked in the keynote about a strategy of acting as if, getting a client to act as if something was true, even though it's not yet true for them. They don't have to believe they are competent, but what would happen if they acted as if they were? They don't have to believe they're assertive, but what would happen if they acted as if they were assertive? I think most important with action strategies is encouraging any actions or steps to create momentum. There is a human physics around momentum, and that once you get a client moving, even if it's not in the ideal direction, it takes far less energy to get them to change direction than it does to get them going in the first place. But by encouraging actions, you create new momentum and they get new sources of feedback, they get new perspectives, and that tends to change the emotions. And then a third one that I use all the time is simply changing the physical environment. So instead of just staying within the counseling office, we'd often go for a walk down the hallway or go for a walk outside. And that change in perspective, that behavior change often created a change in perspective, often created an elevation of mood, which made it much easier for us to deal with situations. So we can see from the Wordle, some of the big ones that your clients are facing are frustration, fear, anxiety, discouraged, hopelessness, confusion, uncertainty. The thing to keep in the back of your mind is that these are powerful filters and they will be distorting almost everything that you do together through those emotional filters. And unless you find a way to help remove them or at least minimize the impact of them, they will tend to see the process through a frustration, fear, anxiety, confusion, anger kind of a lens. So that was essentially the talk that I gave, an encouragement to think of career practitioners' work not as being devoid of emotional work, but rather as an important part of your work. And by harnessing these emotions, you can often get huge progress with your clients. And so with that quick summary, let me turn it over to Tony, because I understand you may have a question or two coming in.
Yeah, we have a few questions already started, and at this point, also remind people, any other questions coming up, please put them in the chat, and because that's what we have the next approximately 40 minutes for. And so before we get to the first question, so thank you again, Kris, for an amazing job of summarizing that down, your initial talk into 50 minutes, and on a personal level, I also appreciate both your land acknowledgement and the acknowledgement of the news of the Kamloops Residential School. Again, I agree. I think that's impacted a lot of people, continues to. I think maybe it wasn't a surprise to all people, but I think it's definitely a surprise to many. And I think it's important to acknowledge the feelings we're going through, particularly with this session. And I think, yeah, I think the impact it's going to have with us ongoing. I think it's a big moment for us.
For sure.
So thanks for that. And I also, again, as people put their questions in, say, just as a reminder for those who don't know, many of Kris's, what he's been talking about here, in addition to the talk, can be found in his book, Career Helping, Harnessing Perspective and Emotion in Everyday Practice. And Kris, you did not know I had this book and I was going to do this, did you?
I did not know that. No, thank you.
See, that little moment of spontaneous reaction is for you, the CEREC webinar viewer, no extra charge. All right, starting us off, Joy asked, what are some helpful engagement strategies?
Well, one of the ones that I find most powerful is to have what I call 5P conversations with folks. People generally engage very readily around the 5Ps. And for those who've never heard of the 5Ps before, it was a distillation of my 5 processes of career counseling that I wrote about a number of years ago. But it starts with trying to get people to tell a story about something of which they hold some pride in. So the first P is pride. And in telling of the story, you can look for ways to find what is it that people find meaningful in that story. They're proud of it for a reason. And so the pride story uncovers a source of passion, and that's the second P. And if you can identify from a client's story what they're passionate about, what they care about, what they hold meaningful, you can use that to start exploring the third P, which is purpose. So how might we harness that thing that you care about, that passion that you have? How might we harness that towards a next kind of an action for you? And then the fourth P is performance, which is doing. So if you have that that purpose, what's one step you can take today, not 5 years from now, not a long time into the future? What can you do today to act on that purpose that you're starting to develop? And then the fifth P is poise, which is grace and dignity in a performance. So how do you develop confidence in the steps that you're taking? So I find those 5 Ps to be almost always clients find that an engaging process. So using a pride story to uncover something meaningful. Another strategy that you might find helpful, brief therapy has what they call the magic question. And the magic question goes something like this: what would life be like if your problem was immediately solved? And that's used as a way to get the client out of their current state and to think about a problem-free existence. In career work, I like to use a variation from a client meaning statement. So find something that they find meaningful, and then the question is, and how would you like it if that was part of your everyday life? Oh, wow, yeah, I'd love it if that was part of my everyday life. So now our job is not to find an occupational destination, it's to find a way that you can exercise that meaning in a daily way. A third kind of strategy that you might find helpful is what I call domain linking. So I gave you a few strategies for dealing with each of the 3 domains, but something that clients very often find helpful and useful and engaging is to link those things. So intentionally link what they're doing to what they're thinking, or what they're thinking to what they're feeling, or what they're feeling to what they're thinking. So it might go something like, when you try that interview process, what thoughts were going through your head? So what you're doing is you're showing them how to connect those pieces on their own, because they tend to see them as separate, or they tend to have one piece of it, like a belief I have about self that then translates into an emotion, which then translates into a behavior, but they're not connecting it. So just intentionally linking. You see an emotion, you say, where might that be coming from? What might you be thinking that led to that emotion? Or when you do that thing, how does it make you feel? So I call that domain linking. I already mentioned as a strategy on the behaviors that simply changing the environment can be extremely engaging. So we're sitting in our office talking, let's get up and go for a walk. Norm Amundsen has a variation on that that he calls walking the problem. So he actually gets the client to physically move over to another side of the room and visualize themselves walking towards a solution to the problem. He's, by the way, Norm has written an entire book on engagement strategies, and you'll find all kinds of good stuff in there. So there's a few ideas.
Wonderful, thank you. I've been scribbling, and just as you've been going, lots of questions are coming in, so fantastic. So I'm going to keep us moving.
Okay.
The question from Lama, she had questions regarding using CBT with clients with emotion. Your thoughts on CBT?
CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is one of the most highly researched forms of counseling intervention. And it is the intervention that has the highest documented efficacy. So we've got more evidence to support the use of CBT than virtually anything else in the counseling world. I like to think of CBT as really one version of the kind of domain thinking that I was just talking about. But it intentionally links thoughts and behaviors. So demonstrating the linkage between what I think and what I do from that. And it does two main things. It shows how our thinking can influence our actions. And if we change our thinking, our action changes are likely to follow. And what that does is helps clients get a sense of control of their lives. So they increase, in Bandura's words, self-efficacy. Another important thing happens, and that is when behaviors change, people get different feedback. And when they get different feedback, their perceptions often change. And they're able to see themselves and their problems differently. So I believe that CBT is enhanced when the emotion is named. A concern I have with strict application of CBT is to ignore the emotional side of it, which some people mistakenly do. It's not necessarily how it was designed, but so I might do something like this. So you're feeling really anxious about that interview. Let's look at what things you are telling yourself about the interview. That's the cognitive part. And then practice a few things you can do to create a better outcome for you. And there's the behavioral part. But we started it as the emotional lever, because that was the entry point. It's also the filter that would make it very difficult for the client to deal with the emotion.
All right. And since you mentioned 5 Ps, they're actually one of the questions that just came in as you were, almost as it was coming out as a bubble. Is there a resource where we can find out more? So I figured this could be a quick one for people who want to know more about the 5 Ps.
I mentioned it in the book that you just mentioned. There's a that one. There are a couple of articles that I've referred to it in, and I'm actually going to be designing a brief course, a 1-hour session on how to use the 5 Ps. So there are a few places where you can see that in action.
Okay, and where do we find this course?
Well, at first, it's going to be available through the Australian Career Development Association, and then we'll see about making it more broadly available.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so for any of our Australian colleagues on the webinar, you get first dibs. All right.
1 hour, just a 1 hour, very quick Pro D kind of a session.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, we have a question here from Irene, who I think we know, who's I think a fellow Saskatchewan native, and she wanted to know What strategies would I offer to move clients from apprehension to enthusiasm?
So Irene, your question comes from the description of the morale curve. So I need to explain a wee bit about that in case other folks haven't seen that yet. When a person enters a new environment, particularly by choice, they have a sense of apprehension. And that apprehension can become an emotional filter or bias that interferes with what they do next. The apprehension comes from two places. The biggest source is simply being in a new environment where the person is not sure about what's going on. And the morale curve postulates that in the normal course of events, without a whole lot of intervention, apprehension gets replaced by enthusiasm as the person starts to learn and figure out how their environment works. So if you think of when you started a new job, you were apprehensive about it, but as you figured out how to get there and you get there on time and how things are working, where the bathroom is and all the important stuff, your apprehension tends to be replaced by a sense of enthusiasm or excitement about where you're going. The second source of apprehension comes from the seeds of anxiety, which find their expression later in the morale curve. Usually after the enthusiasm phase starts to wane a bit, people start to feel anxious. And that anxiety comes from doubts about whether or not a person can do what's expected of them. So to deal with both sources of this apprehension and get people more into the enthusiasm stage, I think it's, excuse me, it's really important to simply normalize the experience. To address any potential that the client might think there's something wrong with them because they're there seeking help from you. The thing that helps the most is simply being really clear and really transparent about both logistics. How'd you find your way down here today? Were you okay in the reception? Yada, that sort of thing. So that's logistics, but as well as the process that you're going to be following. So we'll be spending about 3 sessions together. Each one will be about an hour. These are the things we're going to cover. So by being transparent about process, you deal with the apprehension and people will start to settle down and calm into the process and will likely start to feel a little bit more excited about the potential that the process has to bring them. So again, linking that into the emotion, I'd like to start a session often by saying things like, well, what do you hope to get from our work together? There's the perception and cognition. And how do you feel about being here? So that it's on the table and it's not assumed.
Wonderful.
And, yeah.
So I didn't mean to cut you off, but just so you know, we're probably up to 20 plus questions.
All right.
So, and we got about a half an hour left. So, and there's a follow-up question that I thought was a good one, with still on the morale curve. How do you fortify a person regarding the probably depression stage, such as for a young person seeking better than entry-level employment?
So, first, let me deal with a more generic preparation for the likely depression phase. So the way the prediction goes in the morale curve, you start with apprehension, you go to enthusiasm, you start to feel anxiety, anxiety is replaced by discouragement, then frustration, and then a sense of depression where you stop acting on your environment. So the cognitive process or the perception process that's typically happening is that they may have had high expectations of what would happen, and then they start to feel a little discouraged, disappointed that it's not happening. And when that happens, the mindset becomes, oh, what's the use? No sense moving. I just don't feel like I have the energy to move. So really what's happening is people are getting discouraged because they're starting to feel a loss of momentum. And the best place to deal with that is about 3 phases before it's likely to happen. So while they're in that enthusiasm and maybe early stages of the anxiety stage, I like to ask, or I like to tell them that if you're like 90% of the people I've ever worked with, you're likely to start feeling discouraged about your progress, and you may even feel like you just want to kind of give up on things. That's so common. So I normalize that, let them know it's coming, and then I simply ask them, well, what can we do together if you feel that's starting to happen to you? And for many people, that's all they need, because when they start to feel it, they go, oh yeah, I heard that, you know, Kris said that this was likely going to happen, and you've changed their perception. They're not catastrophizing and they're not blaming themselves. About half of them are likely to actually implement the strategy you worked out. Half are likely to come back and say, yeah, I didn't realize how deep it would get and that will never work. Then you're into exploration of what will work. So again, you've changed the environment of it. For a specific issue, such as discouragement that a young person might feel if they're trying to get an entry-level position and it feels too low, like just, man, I don't want to start at this level. And when they discover that, it's hugely discouraging. For me, the preventative work within the 5 career counseling processes I talk about, the 4th one is the stage of preparation. So once you have an idea of where you want to be going, whether it's an occupational destination or maybe a school, a post-secondary destination, let's do some environmental scanning before you get there so you can see what's going to be happening to you. So I usually will arm the client with a few sets of questions that they can go in and check out that new job environment or check out that new environment so that they're not surprised at the answers they get. And when they come back with what they found, they might say, you know, I found out this and I'm kind of concerned about it. Now we can deal with it. Now we're still in a behavior, cognition, animation, momentum stage, as opposed to come to a crashing halt, which takes tons more energy to get them going again.
All right. Well, thank you for that. There's another question. It was interesting. I just want to build because it's almost the flip side, because some of that example faced on people who are young and the frustrations of that side. Hilda said, sadly, ageism is real.
Yes.
Again, any advice for clients facing ageism? Because I suspect some of that frustration of the outside world is going to be quite real for them.
Yeah. So pick your ism. Ageism, gender discrimination, culture discrimination, racial discrimination. These are all very, very real things that people face. The early days of career helping often assumed that once you made a reasonable choice, a reasonable occupational destination choice, you had equal opportunity to exercise that choice. And that was one of the great fallacies of the test them and tell them or matching strategies. The structure of opportunity is not equal for people. People don't have equal access to opportunity. They don't even have equal access to hearing about or knowing where opportunities might be. So again, I go back to part of the preparation stage is identifying what are the challenges or barriers you're likely to face in trying to implement this decision. Let's understand as many of those as you can see, and then I'll toss in a few that you might not have thought of, and let's think through how are you going to deal with these challenges, these systemic challenges. Now, a little bit of a diversion from that question to do another plug. Some of you may have seen a brilliant piece of work by Dave Redekop and Michael Houston on connecting career development and mental health. And their argument is essentially good career development boosts confidence, boosts self-efficacy, boosts hope, and those are all predictors of mental health and mental well-being. One of the pieces of genius in their work was to link back to another colleague of mine, who all 3 of us have worked a lot with, and that's Brian Hebert, who did a lot of work on impact assessment for counseling, but before that, he was very well known for his work on stress and stress mediation. And what Dave and Mike have done is pulled together the stress mediation strategies as kind of the golden ticket for connecting career development and mental health. And I'm saying all this in the context of something like ageism, because Brian argued that there are 3 things that you can do to deal with stress. You can do something to try to change the environment. So if you've got a nasty boss, maybe having a conversation with the boss about this nastiness, maybe that changes the environment. Or secondly, you can learn new skills to help you adapt better in the environment. And third, you can reframe your perspective about things so that you personally can cope within the environment. Of course, one of your choices is to leave the environment, right? So with those 3 things, if we're dealing with something like ageism, is there anything you can do to change the system? Well, not likely. Right? Are there skills that you can acquire? Probably. Are there attitudes you can acquire? Probably. But knowing full well that when you're dealing with a form of systemic oppression, that there's a tendency to feel, well, you will feel victimized, and there's a tendency by broader society to blame the victim then. So we need to change that self-talk and the messages that person's receiving from others so that they do not blame themselves for that systemic injustice. That said, there are some strategies we can use to combat ageism. One of them is to do a survey, have your own kind of survey when you're looking at options to see what kind of attitudes are present in each of these places that are more or less likely to have ageism as part of what they're doing. And so you might make a decision about where you're going to put your energies based on that kind of data that you're finding out. We did that very successfully with young kids to help differentiate between what we called career arresting and career promoting entry-level jobs. By asking a few questions of the employer, you could decide pretty quickly if this is a dead-end entry job or is this an entry job that could have some progression to it. So I think we could probably spend like many sessions talking about strategies to deal with systemic barriers. I think the most important thing for us as a profession is that we work together as a collective to challenge some of these forms of systemic oppression.
Yeah.
And then work with clients to, as best they can, deal with one of those 3 stress intervention strategies. But the bigger work is in getting rid of the systemic issues to begin with.
Yeah, no, great point. And I think this is where some of our associations and larger bodies can do some of that work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'd like to see there be working groups within each of our national bodies that's addressing some of these systemic issues.
Okay. I agree there. So let's see, hopefully someone picks up that challenge. A whole bunch of questions relating to, again, more with some specific populations and how people, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions here.
Okay.
Anne was saying some of my clients are not emotionally mature. How can I change perspective in a short period of time? And Sarah was asking, what is your advice for working with clients who are differently abled? For example, I have a client with suspected FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and some of the work around emotions can be a bit more difficult than with others. Thoughts for Sarah and Anne?
So particularly starting with the second piece, so working with somebody like fetal alcohol syndrome, sometimes forms of cognitive impairment, sometimes forms of emotional disabilities. We're not going to change the core functioning capacity of the individual. But I think it's equally important that we help, let's take the FASD individual. It's still important that we name the emotion that we see present because it helps them connect their behaviors to the emotions. Often there are forms of acting out kinds of behaviors like anger. Okay, you're doing this, and that makes me think you're feeling really angry right now. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. okay, how do we channel this? So you want to set some parameters of behaviors that are okay and not okay, and then help teach the person to operate within those. So it might be, how are you, let's practice this emotion control here, so that it doesn't haunt you when you're not here, when you're out in the workforce, for example. For people who are particularly younger people or older folks who never did mature emotionally, the emotion is often easily triggered. And it's important to look at what are the triggering mechanisms. So what is it that typically causes this kind of reaction in you? And to spend more of your time thinking about triggers and then mediating the impact of the triggers, as opposed to trying to control the emotion. Because the emotionally immature person has, by definition, little emotional control. So you focus on the cognition and the behavior. So when you see this observation, you know this is a trigger. So before you let it get to blow you apart, what are the steps you can take between the trigger and your normal reaction?
Great. So related, again, there's a lot of themes on here that keep coming up. So, and I think some of this you've touched on, so maybe just add, but Sarah was asking, how do you approach a student that suffers from self-sabotage? And Karen was also talking about dealing with a client that's very angry and frustrated that they aren't able to find the type of work they're looking for and are in survival jobs. So if you can touch on that.
Well, those deeper emotions tend to be the ones that also trigger other negative reactions in others. And so people see the frustration, people see the anger, and it's kind of like, you put a wall up and you say, okay, we've got to stay away from this person. For me, the thing that I have found most helpful, not necessarily the easiest, but the most helpful, is to simply explore the impact of the emotion that you saw. So a client experiences that they're feeling really, really frustrated at this process, right? It's unfair. They've done everything they can think of. Nothing is working. They're deeply frustrated by it. So let's understand this frustration a little bit more. How do you experience the frustration? What does it look like for you? And when you're frustrated, what happens next? And how would you like to remove the frustration from the process that you're experiencing? So part of it now, once we've understood the scope of the frustration or the anger or whatever it is that's kind of getting in the way, we need to then help find a path. Usually it's in the work that we do together with the client, to look for alternative thoughts and alternative behaviors. And depending on the client, they may respond better to an alternative thought. So this is a reframing. Why are you so frustrated? Because the system is unfair, because I've tried everything. Okay, so the system might very well be unfair. What sorts of things might we try to do to help get around the barrier, not overcome it, but get around that barrier of it being unfair? Because there's another unfair bit. Not only are you perhaps being discriminated against, but then they're also using your reaction as a way to validate their discrimination. So if you want to reinforce their belief that you should not be hired, keep doing what you're doing. It's kind of the message that you give, perhaps in a slightly more gentle form. But what we need to do is in the talk that I gave, I talked about an activation sequence, that there's an activation sequence of belief, perception, emotion, behavior, and then there's this negative cycle that people go through. And we need to break the activation sequence. And again, I go back to working with one of the three domains or all three of them. Try one. If that didn't work, go to the other. What's in your thought process when that triggers the frustration for you? What you do. So we need to change one of those two things. We're not going to actively try to change your emotion. We're going to try to change a thought or an action, and then see what that does with the emotion.
All right, thank you. And I would say, and I know I've been plugging this, but the book actually starts with a wonderful story about Alvin. There we go. Which, you know, is a real extreme case of a client who we can say high level anger and frustration.
Yes.
So, so I know I really appreciated reading that and getting those insights. And again, for those who want more, you can, you know, there's opportunities to go a little deeper. But I think it's such an interesting and powerful example right off the bat in the book. So thank you for sharing that, and great way to start. Got me hooked.
Thank you. So that example that you brought up, part of the power of it was, yes, it was like really extreme emotion that Alvin was demonstrating, but the frustration came from several of the systemic experiences that he had. First Nations male, parents in residential schools. He had no parenting to speak of. He had alcohol addiction. He was dwarf, suffered from dwarfism. So I think he was under 3 feet tall. So you know, you pick your systemic barrier, and he had it. And it's not that his anger and frustration wasn't legitimate.
Yeah.
In fact, it was helpful for him to understand that, well, that's normal that you'd be reacting. Of course, who wouldn't be, right?
Yeah.
But now, nothing you've done so far has worked, so we need to try something new. So we need to get a new perspective.
Okay, thank you. And maybe building on that, I have a great question from Megan. How can you help a client deal with feelings of systemic racism when you yourself are dealing with those feelings in your own position?
What a lovely question. There's another follow-up to the talk was a really quick blog article that that you may have seen through Sarek, and I called it "There are two elephants in this room." So the presence of client emotion in career work is an elephant in the room, but the other elephant in the room is your own emotion, your own sense of how you're engaging with difficult issues. And you put those two together, and that can be either powerful, but it's always powerful. It can either be powerful for good or powerful for not helping so much. So when you're struggling with these very, very same issues, either because you have experienced them or because you are witnessing them, and perhaps witnessing them in a way that you hadn't really seen them before. You're coming to terms, just as rather belatedly, Canada is only now starting to come to terms with the atrocities in the residential school system. And people who are not part of the residential school system, people who were the part of the settler community, often have feelings of guilt and shame, and they don't know how to deal with that. They don't know how do I park that if the next person that walks into my office is a residential school survivor. And a lesson I learned while I was co-chair of our university's Aboriginal Reconciliation Council with the other co-chair was Kris Lewis, who is a Squamish First Nations counselor. And we learned very quickly that reconciliation is walking a path, creating a path together. And the way we did that is that we acknowledged our own struggles with reconciliation every time we held a public meeting. And that's where that emotional landscape acknowledgement came from. It was a residential school survivor came up to us and said, we're never going to be able to think about creating this better path for SFU until you acknowledge that we're in just really deep emotional territory. You're triggering, this discussion triggers all kinds of emotions for the settler community as well as for the Indigenous community. So once again, acknowledging the emotion, acknowledging my own uncertainty, helps you to park that. It's transparent, and now we're equals working together. One of the things I told Alvin in the story that you referred to, Tony, was I have no idea how we're going to help you, but I'm going to promise you this. I promise you that I will never judge you, but at the same time, I'll never lie to you. I'll always tell you what I'm seeing. If that's a behavior that's inappropriate, I'll tell you, you're doing this now. Do you want that? So that was the promise. And the second piece was that I will walk with you through this, and together I'm so confident in our process. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I'm really confident in our process, and I will help you through this thing together. And then the third thing is that if we both hang in there, I have confidence that we're going to be able to find a preferred future path for you. And so I acknowledge that this is going to be a struggle. I acknowledge I don't know what the path is going to look like. I acknowledge I have my own issues that I need to deal with, and that something you say might trigger me. But that's okay. We'll just work through this together.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, yeah, the acknowledgement of struggle and challenge, I think, is such an important one. And it's amazing that some people almost feel like they're not allowed to say that. Yes,
absolutely. And so we go back to Roger's early teaching about authenticity. You know, you have to be genuine, you have to be authentic. Yet you are who you are. You're dealing with what you're dealing with. Client change is often a function of authenticity and the nature of the working alliance that you can have together.
Wonderful. We're almost at time.
I
don't know if you can answer this one in 1 minute, but it's a good one from Justin.
In 1 minute.
This is like the quick. Do you let your client know what change strategy you're using with them?
Absolutely.
So that was less than a minute.
Yeah, it may be immediately after I've done it, because there'll be like a teachable moment, so you just go into something. But always part of the transparency, part of the structuring skill is what we just did there. So you expressed an emotion, I acknowledged it, and then I wanted to know where it came from. So that's going to be something that we'll do throughout this process. And then they go, you're doing that, aren't you? I go, yeah, that's what I'm doing. What's happened? They've actually just learned some self-management strategies. They don't need me anymore when it becomes, there's a metacognition of the process.
Wonderful.
Okay. Our job is to make ourselves redundant as soon as we can.
Well, thank you. Okay, and with that, you nailed it right at the time that I needed you to end. Thank you for that. Not that you said redundant, is I'm sure people will want to hear more. And again, thank you for everyone who's been sending all the questions. There's lots more. Apologies we didn't have time to get to them. And I just want to again thank you again, Dr. Kris Magnusson, for this wonderful session. It's one of these, I think, I could have been part of this conversation for at least another hour or so, but contractual obligations are what they are. We need to wrap up now. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you so much. And I just want to raise my hands to all the people out there that are working in such a difficult, trying environments. And I so appreciate the work that you do with all of your clients. So thank you, and thank you for participating today.
It was great to see all those questions coming out through the webinar. Thank you all for your involvement. Kris and Tony, thank you both for this engaging conversation. There was definitely a lot to learn about working with emotions and career helping, and we appreciate the time you put to respond to the questions. I'm hoping everyone will take a few moments to complete the survey on this webinar that will pop up on the screen at the end of this call. We are pleased to now be offering past webinars on demand, webinars on autism, mental health, remote career services, older workers, and self-care are now available for you to watch. You can just go to our website to see them. And next week, we will be adding recording of recent webinar series on experiential learning, cultural intelligence, as well as financial literacy. So please watch for the announcement. And thanks for Kris, Tony, and all you for your participation. I wish you all a very nice day. And we will add the title for Kris's book to our email that will go out today for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.